comes. Actually, in Syria, the only way is to invade and control the situation. And otherwise, anything else is not going to solve it. And I understand by saying that sounds incredibly dramatic, and everyone's going, intated breath, it's like, oh my God, we can't be doing that. But at the moment, I can't see another way of doing it unless we have some really clever special forces operations going in, or we have snatch squads taking people away who can, rather like the Israelis are alleged to do in Iran with all of those nuclear scientists that suddenly have started falling off motorbikes. A very clever strategy, I might add, if that is what they're doing. But you're right, we need to find a way of deterring, and I don't think what was being advocated on Thursday was an effective deterrent. Gentlemen.
Nobody's mentioned it yet, but for those who take an interest in the Middle East, it's well known that Syria is only a stepping stone on the way to Iran. This was well documented in Israel Shahak's Open Secrets book. Also, the speech by and the NATO Supreme Commander, General Wesley Clark, whereby they were. So, bearing in mind, of course, that Russia and China have closer ties to Iran than they do to Syria, we can only really speculate on the horrific circumstances of going further.
Yes, I mean, again, this is the other. I mean, there are so many layers to this problem that we have an Iranian regime that, although there's been a recent election where a more moderate Prime Minister has been elected, ultimately it is a theocracy. It's the religious elders who are in charge, and yes, I mean it's highly complex, and again it's another reason for thinking twice before intervening.
They've only got a theocracy because the democratic government under Mossadegh was overthrown in the coup
by us. Yes, us Americans. And I know, that's 1953. It's one of the bequests of Churchill that I wish he hadn't made. Actually, it was his decision. That was all him. And it was all driven by access to Anglo-Iranian oil, which nowadays is called BP. So I hear what you say, sir, and we have a track record of mucking around there, which is, in Iran, is why the British are always in the conspiracy. There's even TV dramas in Iran, which have it's always the Brit who's the one not to trust. And so, of course, it's extremely difficult, which is again why we need a wider sort of, how do we approach this? And Hezbollah, which is obviously backed by Iran as well. And we've not also mentioned, I mean, Israel has come up once or twice, but who would be Israel in the middle of this? I mean, it's highly complex, highly complex, which is why we should not be making this up as we go along, which is why we need to think about it at length, before any action, really. And I fear there's going to be an action. I think that if I was a faction of the Syrian government that fired the last one, I'd be firing another one about 2 days before the Congress vote. Because you want to escalate the situation. You want the Russians to become more involved because that's your only hope of maintaining the regime as power. So I fear, of course I don't know, but I fear that they're going to try and provoke a Congress response that's going to support action. And at that point, the decision has to be made again, I suspect. Probably not for us that time, but these things are going to escalate. And we just need to have a plan. And feel quite strongly about it. It's not good enough to be committing generations in this country to instability and risk of retaliation on the streets of London, of Crowthorne, or wherever, without actually having said, this is why we're doing it. Thank you.
Just very briefly, do you feel that there is definitely no hope of diplomatic means to resolve this? I mean, because when Parliament, voted the other day,
Yes.
and, you know, David Cameron and we're going to lead the humanitarian side to it is very good. Is there a way that Britain could be leading still on a diplomatic way with the Iranians, with the Russians, with other countries which have obviously got very sensitive concerns?
Yeah,
Are we giving up on the
no,
diplomatic?
not at all. I mean, I think our engagement should be diplomatic. I think it should be cultural. I think it should, in isolated examples, be military. I think but you need to engage on many, many fronts. The problem with the diplomatic front is, and I asked this question, I think it was last year, Bashar Assad is essentially a weak person. He was the son who was not supposed to get the presidency. He was the second eldest. The one who was supposed to get it was some sort of nutcase playboy who died in a car crash. So he ended up getting the sort of inheritance from his father. And his father was a strong, nasty individual who killed 20,000 people in one operation in the 80s, something we also didn't respond to. And when he took over the crown, everyone thought it was almost like it's this new president, beautiful English educated wife. She was on the cover of Vogue. Everyone thought, oh, there's a brighter future. But the problem was he wasn't actually seemingly in charge. His mother is still very, very influential, and his brother is very, very influential. There are 4 families. It's like a mafiosi-style situation throughout. They have fiefdoms. So who exactly do you engage with? Who do you talk to? Who can deliver a diplomatic solution when there are so many complicated elements to the regime itself before you start talking about Russia, Iran, and the US and the French and the British and the Israelis and the Saudis and the Qataris and everybody else. I mean, this is hugely, hugely complex. And so, no, I would never say rule out diplomatic solutions, but I'm also a realist. And over 100,000 people have died. That's 100,000 fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. There's a lot of bad blood. And I fear that there's going to be quite a lot of difficulty trying to get people to talk. When I spoke to a Syrian religious elder who'd been kicked out in late 2011, he was living in Morocco at the time, and I rang him, it was May, and he said, we need military intervention, we need people to come and help us. But he didn't mean Tomahawk cruise missile strikes, he meant boots on the ground. And the reason he said it was, it's descending into chaos, villages are forming their own armies to defend individual villages, individual towns, it's becoming totally broken up, and trying to deliver a diplomatic solution in those circumstances without a stable country is a challenge. And so I think that it should be part of it for sure, and will be part of it, of course it will, because the Russians are going to want to be squared off and the Iranians are going to want to be squared off. But I can't quite see how you bring it about when the country itself is utterly chaotic. So it's, I wish I could be more positive, but I can't, I genuinely can't. Gentlemen, yeah.
Yeah, when you talk about chemical weapons, in the Vietnam War, the Americans dropped orange agent all over Vietnam. Does that count as chemical weapons or not? Well,
Actually, it's a good question. Napalm is not.
Oh, right.
Okay. Agent Orange, I think, isn't as well. This is going back to the original discussion I had with the gentleman over here.
Yeah,
This is the problem.
Yeah.
This is the problem.
It's a bit hypocritical then, isn't it?
Well, it just shows you how the inconsistencies surrounding this whole debate as to why we would react to a sarin attack but not a napalm attack. I mean, it's like, I can remember seeing that dreadful photograph of that child's back in Vietnam in books, and it's like, how come that's an acceptable? That was acceptable, but what we see on YouTube is not acceptable. It is, again, it's something we need to debate and discuss and to talk about, to think about. Cluster bombs apparently are acceptable. This is all over the place as far as I'm concerned. The moral relativity of all of this, it's all over the place, and I think it needs much more proper debate before we start trying to determine whether we act or not on the basis of regulations which you've just highlighted don't make a lot of sense.
You said that the situation is extremely complex, and I detect a sort of slight softening of your approach in your admissions that we don't really know what's going on. Now, the whole situation is far more complicated probably than we can imagine, and we've got to look at the bigger picture. A few days ago I sent you a link to a YouTube interview with General Wesley Clark in 2007, when he recounted after 11 days after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon, saw an old colleague there, and said basically, "What's the news?" And his colleague says, "Well, we're going to war with Iraq." And he said, "Why?" And the chap said, "I don't know. We're just going to war with Iraq." He went back about 3 weeks later and said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, his colleague said, "It's even worse than that. We are going to take out," it's come down from upstairs, that we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years. And those countries included Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. So, what exactly is going on? Why are we concentrating on the instantaneous pictures, which are very good at emotionally swinging our mood in behind a certain course of action, rather than looking at the bigger picture and trying to dissect exactly what is going on and whether we're all being taken for a ride?
Well, I think that's what I've said. My point is that we shouldn't be reactive to imagery, and that everything we do should be based around a thought-through strategy, a broad strategy to the region. What you describe, if what you said, I didn't watch the YouTube clip you sent me, so apologies, but at least that was a strategy that they were considering. I'm not saying it was one I would follow, but at least it was a strategy that recognised the Middle East was more than just one problem, was more than just one country. And I guess what that quote you give me says to me is that there are people who recognise the scale of the problem and the scale of the challenge. It can have a direct impact on us, even if it's not a military impact, even if it's not a loss of life. If oil barrel prices go north of $200 as a direct result of widespread chaos and instability in the Middle East, boy, we'd know about it in this country. Our economy would be on its knees. And now, I'm not saying that's a reason enough to commit tens of thousands of troops. I'm just saying that we cannot claim that it isn't going to have an impact on us. It might just have an emotional impact on us because of the footage. It might sort of tear at our heartstrings, sort of our moral core, that Britain has a proud history of in recent times of acting on what is right and what is wrong. But it actually will have an economic impact upon us. And the Russians, you see, need at least $100 a barrel to pay their bills on a daily basis. So they have a vested interest in chaos.
I think you say about the implication of what Wesley Clark said was that it wasn't a problem that they were going to try and sort out. It was a problem that they were probably going to create.
Sure, and so I'm not commenting upon that strategy. It's just that at least it reflected the regionality, the fact that it isn't just one country. It wasn't just Iraq. The other thing I'd just say, and I really should move on to other subjects, I think, but the other thing I must say is that we are present at a time where there is an unravelling of a settlement in the Middle East. The borders were all drawn up by Sykes-Picot, a Frenchman and an Englishman, who the Englishman had never visited the region. Okay, and they were going, well, we'll do that there, we'll do that there, and we'll do that there. And they created countries that weren't actually countries that had evolved over time like our own. And the borders went across tribal loyalties, across ethnic loyalties, and they did it because they gave Syria to the French, we got a bit, it was all a bit of divvying it up. Unfortunately, that is unravelling in front of our eyes, at the same time as the people across the Middle East, via the internet, are discovering freedom. They are discovering the value of the freedom of expression, the freedom of movement. And at the same time as that, we're also getting what appears to be some sort of Islamic Reformation. I likened it in the chamber to the Catholic Church in the 15th, 16th century, realising it had to give power to nation states away from the papal heart. And there is a sense now that Islam, the last great religion on earth, in terms of when it came here, hasn't yet worked out how you can have a situation where only God can make law in a world in which countries and nation states want to make law. And so all of this is happening in front of our eyes, layer upon layer, in addition to Russia, Iran, and all the other conflicting sort of priorities for each country. And that's the problem. It is that complex, that challenging, and it is going to be, and is at the moment, leading to a loss of life. I suspect and I fear that the loss of life will continue and may even accelerate. And we have to ask ourselves, what part do we play in all of this? I don't know the answer, but I am prepared to accept that we don't know the answer, and when you don't know the answer, you go looking for one, and you get your best brains to find it. Judgment about it.
I think there's a lot of naivety attached to this statement about Syria. I mean, the Americans, the British, the French, etc., they deposed Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, created chaos everywhere, okay? And for what reason? Basically, control of oil, etc., etc. Well, President Obama, I mean, talk about a hypocrite, you know, he talks about chemical weapons. The weapons you would talk about in Syria is actually ricin, I believe, is that correct? Sarin, okay, well that's quite...
That's what's alleged to be.
I think, well, whatever, I think it's manufactured from rice, is that correct?
No, I don't. They've not decided, because they've not decided what it is.
Well,
but it is a neurological condition, judging by what I
either side, who actually manufactured the weapons, whether it was Assad or the rebels. But the question that we want to ask is who's arming the rebels? If the rebels had no guns, there wouldn't be any conflict, and then Assad wouldn't fight back. This has to be a diplomatic situation rather than an aggressive situation. The Americans, since independence, have been responsible for 172 conflicts throughout the world. They're a warmongering nation. Aberdeen, Carlisle, all these big countries, they produce arms. If there's no wars, they don't make any money.
Okay.
There's your question answered.
All right. In terms of who's funding what, the Qataris and the Saudis are funding different groups. I was in Saudi Arabia in March on a delegation, and I went to this delegation because I wanted to find out what their strategy was, what their plan was, and we had remarkable access. The only person I didn't meet was the king, and they were committed to, they had a plan and it was going to work, and they wanted stability in the region. The Saudis are desperately worried, or the ones people who rule Saudi Arabia are desperately worried about the instability that is surrounding them. Yemen is a failed state, Egypt is edging towards that, and they have Iraq and Syria on their northern border, and they have a Jordanian royal family that is deeply unpopular, and they are trying to stem the tide in Syria. That's essentially what they're trying to do. And they're doing it by providing arms and guidance or whatever else they're doing. The Qataris themselves are also doing this, and some of this is seems to have a religious component to it. As I said, it's Sunni, the Qatari and Saudis are Sunnis, and they're backing Sunni outfits, some of whom are the sort of people who don't like us, and so that's difficult for us. And the Iranians are backing Hezbollah, who are Shia, and also they don't particularly like us as well. So I hear what you say about weapons, but they're there. The arms are there, and I really, what do we do? I mean, this is a massive challenge. So what do you advocate? I mean, I think doing nothing is, I suppose, an acceptable position to take. You could say, that's it, just not interested, nothing to do with us, we're not going to do anything about it, we're more interested in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and that's the way it is. We're no longer a great power, can't afford it. I've had all these emails, okay? That's the position that some people want to take. I don't take that position. I'm realistic about our strength and our ability to afford things. I'm realistic about that for sure, but I don't take a position of saying don't get involved. I'm just saying get involved, but know what you're doing and know where you're going. Right, has anybody not spoken? Yes, this gentleman.
Right, well, first of all, I sent you an email this week.
Did I get to it, sir? Did I respond?
Probably not, but I congratulated you on the start you took in Parliament.
Thank you.
But also, as part of that, because I also asked you about the transparency of lobbying
Yes.
and non-party campaign and trade union administration bill, which some people described as legislation's most malicious assault on campaigners and living members.
Yeah.
Do you know about that?
Yeah, I do. And